by steam train. A pioneer in the travel system that one day would tie our nation together. That was the way I got to Illinois in the 1840s.
In 1908, fireman Charles Reed testified before the Interstate Commerce Commission about his Pennsylvania Railroad work. On the climb through the Alleghenies, you shovel for 9 miles without a flat section. The grade does not give you a rest. The engine does not give you a rest. The firebox does not give you a rest. By the time you reach the summit at Galitzin, you have moved 1.5 tons of coal. Your back tells you. It told me when I was 32. I am 38 now, and it has not stopped. He is in the Interstate Commerce Commission record. If you are new to Steel and Sweat, this channel covers the machines and the men of American industrial history, the things that built the country and what those things cost. Subscribe and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. This is the history of the Locomotive Fireman on the Pennsylvania Railroad, examined through the documents that recorded him. The Interstate Commerce Commission testimony of Brotherhood members, including Charles Reed from the 1908 hearings, the Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen Quarterly Journal from 1890 through 1915, the Brotherhood's accident and medical records, and the engineering specifications of the Pennsylvania Railroad's Allegheny mountain crossing, the route through Horseshoe Curve and the Galitzin tunnels that was the hardest sustained grade assignment in Eastern American railroading. The firemen on that route burned more coal per mile than on any other section of the Pennsylvania system. He shoveled more coal per shift than his counterparts on the flat lines through Ohio and Indiana. His back deteriorated faster. He died closer to his firebox than the engineer did, and the Brotherhood kept count of all of it because the Brotherhood was founded on December 1st, 1873, specifically because the men who held this job understood that nobody else was going to. But before we get to the Alleghenies, you need to understand what the job was. What were you doing in that cab? And why did the specific grade at Horseshoe Curve produce the specific injury pattern the Brotherhood's medical records document? But you are a locomotive fireman on the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1900. You are 24 years old. You have been working this route for 2 years, which means you have made the Altoona to Johnstown run dozens of times. You know Horseshoe Curve the way you know a recurring nightmare, every detail, every sound, every moment when the engine begins to labor. Your job is to keep the fire that moves this train. Everything else the locomotive does depends on you. The firebox is a steel chamber at the rear of the boiler, directly in front of where you stand or sit on the fireman's side of the cab. In the locomotive classes running the Allegheny crossing in 1900, the firebox is large enough to require practice technique for coal distribution. You are not simply throwing coal into a hole. You are managing a combustion system that the engineer depends on for steam pressure. And steam pressure is what determines whether this train climbs the grade or stalls on it. Too little fire and pressure drops. Too much coal piled wrong and the fire smothers. The firebox has a door. Every time you open it, radiant heat from the interior strikes your face and arms. The temperature at the firebox opening during a hard climb exceeds 1,000 degrees Fahrenheit. Your shovel weighs roughly 8 to 10 pounds empty. Each load of coal weighs between 15 and 20 pounds. On a flat section at moderate speed, a fireman might shovel once every minute or two, maintaining steady pressure. On the Allegheny climb, you shovel continuously because the engine is burning coal faster than it burns on any flat section in the system, and the grade is 9 miles long and it does not flatten. But Horseshoe Curve is a 220-degree arc of track, completed by the Pennsylvania Railroad in 1854. It was built by Irish immigrant laborers using picks, shovels, horses, and drags. With no heavy equipment, Chief Engineer J. Edgar Thompson needed to cross the Allegheny summit without a grade steep enough to stall loaded trains. His solution was to loop the track through 2 mountain ravines, ascending gradually and keeping the maximum grade below 2%. The curve climbs from roughly 1,500 feet of elevation at the base to the summit at Galitzin at approximately 2,167 feet. The total distance from Altoona to the summit is about 12 miles. For 9 of those miles, the grade is sustained. It does not flatten. What does that mean in the cab? It means from the moment your train enters the mountain grade until you reach the Gallitzin tunnels at the summit, the locomotive is working at or near maximum output. Maximum output means maximum coal consumption. Maximum coal consumption means the fireman is shoveling at or near maximum rate for 9 miles. 9 miles at 2% grade in a steam locomotive of 1900 vintage takes somewhere between 30 to 45 minutes at climbing speed. During that time, you do not stop shoveling. The engine does not give you a rest because the grade does not give the engine a rest. Charles Reed put a number on it in his Interstate Commerce Commission testimony. 1 ton to 1.5 tons of coal moved between Altoona and Gallitzin. A ton of coal is 2,000 pounds. A fireman working a 15-pound shovel to move 2,000 pounds has made roughly 133 shovel loads. Shoveling each load correctly requires the shovel to be swung from the coal pile at the rear of the tender, around and through the firebox door, with enough force and aim to distribute the coal across the grate rather than piling it in one spot. This motion requires the full rotation of the upper body. It requires the shoulders, the lower back, and the core muscles on every repetition, and it is repeated 133 times at minimum in the 30 to 45 minutes of the mountain climb, in a cab that is hot from the firebox on your right and cold from the open window on your left. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen had been tracking what this work did to bodies since its founding. The Brotherhood was organized on December 1st, 1873, by Joshua Leach and 10 other Erie Railroad firemen in Port Jervis, New York, after they had to deliver the news of a fatal accident to the widow of a fellow fireman named George Page, and realized the man's family had nothing. The Brotherhood began as a death benefit society. It became a medical archive by necessity, because the pattern of injuries and deaths was consistent enough across enough members that the Brotherhood's physicians began to classify what they were seeing as occupational disease rather than individual misfortune. What they classified was specific. Spinal compression injury resulted from the sustained rotational loading of the shoveling motion. Shoulder deterioration came from the same cause, specific to the joints that bore the weight of the loaded shovel at the apex of each swing. Heat prostration was documented as a cause of fatality at a higher rate among firemen than among engineers, because the firemen stood closer to the firebox. The Brotherhood's quarterly journal tracked this data across its membership. The engineer sat on the opposite side of the cab. The fireman's position was beside the firebox door. The Brotherhood's medical records documented a statistically measurable higher rate of back injury, shoulder injury, and heat prostration fatality among firemen than among engineers. The reason was not the grade, not the hours, not the coal weight per se. The reason was the geometry of the cab. The fireman was closer to the source of the heat that killed you, and the motion that destroyed your spine. What were you paid for this? In 1900, a locomotive fireman on the Pennsylvania Railroad earned roughly half what the engineer earned. The engineer made somewhere between $3.50 and $4 per day on mountain runs. The fireman made between $1.75 and $2. He had less authority, less status, less pay, and more exposure. He was not the most skilled worker in the cab. He was the most physically destroyed one. The progression from fireman to engineer was the career path, spending years on the fireman's side, learning the route, learning the machine, learning to read the grade and the steam pressure and the engineer's habits, until a position opened. The Brotherhood estimated an average of 7 to 10 years spent as a fireman before promotion to engineer on a mountain run. 7 to 10 years of the Allegheny climb, 7 to 10 years of the rotational loading that Charles Reed described to the ICC at 38 years old, still feeling what had happened to his back at 32. If you are finding this history as important as anything we have covered on this channel, go ahead and hit subscribe right now and leave a comment below with the next story you want to see. But here's the other dimension of this job that the Brotherhood's records document with equal precision. Boiler failure. The firemen watched the water glass. On every run, on every section of track, the fireman's continuous task beyond coal management was monitoring the water level in the boiler. The water glass was a narrow tube of glass mounted on the boiler backhead, the wall facing into the cab, showing the water level inside. If it showed water, the boiler was safe. If the level dropped below the crown sheet, the steel plate at the top of the firebox, that sheet would overheat, the stay bolts would crack, and the boiler would fail. A boiler failure at running pressure was not an explosion in the conventional sense. It was an instantaneous phase transition. Superheated water at operating pressure suddenly contacting the overheated crown sheet, vaporized in a fraction of a second. The stored energy released instantly. The boiler left the frame. Men who survived boiler failures by being thrown clear described the sound as everything at once. Men who were closer did not describe anything. But the fireman was closer to the firebox than the engineer. In a boiler failure, this was the relevant geography. The Brotherhood's fatality records from 1873 through 1910 document boiler explosions as the leading cause of fireman deaths. The railroad workers' fatality rate in the early 1890s ran at approximately 9 per thousand annually, higher than hard rock mining. Mountain runs on sustained grade with the boiler at or near maximum output were not the average of that statistic. They were the upper end. What did the fireman know about all of this? He knew what the Brotherhood's quarterly journal told him, which was the truth, organized and documented and published for the membership. The Brotherhood did not hide the injury and fatality data from its members. It published it so that members understood what the benefit payments were for what the mutual insurance system was protecting against and what was happening to the body of a man who did this work for 20 years. The initiation ritual of the Brotherhood included, explicitly, the display of a stereopticon image sequence. A fireman leaving his family to go to work, a train in operation, a train wreck, a funeral attended by Brotherhood members, and a Brotherhood representative delivering the death indemnity to the grieving widow. The man being initiated watched his own symbolic death and understood that the organization he was joining was built around the statistical certainty that some fraction of them would not come home. But he climbed into the cab anyway, every shift, because this was the work available, and because the coal had to move, and because the trains that Carnegie's steel came to market on required a fireman to keep them running, and because somewhere behind him in the dark a man's family depended on the $2 a day this job paid. The Pennsylvania Railroad's Allegheny crossing handled roughly 60% of all freight moving between the eastern seaboard and Pittsburgh and the midwestern industrial cities by the early 20th century. The railroad employed more than 30,000 workers by 1880 and was the nation's single largest corporation. Every ton of freight that crossed the summit at Gallitzin went on the fire the firemen built. The fireman on that mountain was not a footnote to the industrial economy of the United States. He was the mechanism by which the industrial economy of the United States moved its product to market. Carnegie's steel, Rockefeller's oil, the mail, the passengers, the military freight in wartime, every ton of it went over the Allegheny summit on the fire he built. Charles Reed's testimony to the Interstate Commerce Commission in 1908 was part of the Brotherhood's campaign to force the railroad industry to address the specific medical consequences of the firemen's work. The Brotherhood wanted regulation of shift length, mandatory rest periods between mountain runs, and recognition of spinal compression and shoulder deterioration as compensable occupational injuries rather than natural deterioration. The campaign produced incremental results over many years. The Hours of Service Act of 1907 limited certain railroad workers to 16-hour shifts, but firemen on mountain runs working sustained climbs within those hours continued to accumulate the injuries Reed described. Reed's words to the Interstate Commerce Commission are specific enough to stand as their own documentation. They do not require supplementary argument. A man describing what a grade does to his body over 6 years, at 38 years old, with the medical language of someone who has learned it from his own injury history, is giving the Interstate Commerce Commission something no engineering report can match. The grade does not give you a rest. The engine does not give you a rest. The firebox does not give you a rest. The fireman's job on the Pennsylvania Railroad changed significantly with the introduction of mechanical stokers in the 1920s. A steam-driven screw conveyor fed crushed coal into the firebox at rates no man could match by hand. The physical strain of the shoveling motion was removed. What remained was the management of the stoker, the monitoring of combustion, and the water glass vigil. Back injuries declined. Heat prostration fatalities declined more slowly because the geometry of the cab had not changed. The fireman was still the man nearest to the firebox. Steam operations on the Pennsylvania Railroad continued through the 1950s. The Pennsylvania Railroad's K4S Pacific locomotives, the primary passenger power on the Allegheny crossing through the 1930s and the 1940s, required a fireman managing the mechanical stoker at every stage of the mountain climb. The steam temperature in the firebox of a K4S at maximum output reached roughly 2,400 degrees Fahrenheit. The cab temperature on the fireman's side in summer on the mountain grade was, in Brotherhood testimony, a punishment that had no name. The stoker removed the shoveling injury. It did not remove the fireman from the heat. The last steam fireman on the Pennsylvania Railroad worked alongside mechanical stokers and did not shovel by hand the way Charles Reed had. But for the generation of men who worked the Allegheny crossing in the 1890s, the 1900s, and the 1910s, before the mechanical stoker was adopted, the job was what Reed had described to the Interstate Commerce Commission: 9 miles of uninterrupted shoveling, 1 ton to 1.5 tons of coal, and a back that began telling you about it at 32 and did not stop. Charles Reed's testimony is in the Interstate Commerce Commission hearing records of 1908, available through the National Archives. The Brotherhood of Locomotive Firemen's Quarterly Journal from 1890 through 1915 is in the labor history collections of several university libraries. The Brotherhood's medical documentation is in the same archives. The engineering specifications of Horseshoe Curve are maintained by the Railroaders Memorial Museum in Altoona and by the National Historic Landmark Records at the National Park Service. The fire Reed built is long out, but the curve is still there. If this kind of history matters to you, subscribe to Steel and Sweat and leave a comment below with the next story you want us to dig into. Thanks for watching.